Hello, welcome to a special spooky coding train video about ES6. The arrow function. Spooky arrow function. Hold on a sec. I'm recording this close to Halloween, and when you're watching this in the future, you won't care and this will be ridiculous, but that's what the video is starting with anyway. What is this thing? I have to say, for a very long time, I have seen this in code, and I just kind of shrivel up and feel very worried because it's something that I don't understand, and I think that I'm supposed to understand it, and it's supposed to make things better, but I just don't understand. So I've taken some time to attempt to understand it. I've used it, and I'm intending to use it in some future videos that I'm going to make, possibly even today. So I feel it's time for me to attempt to talk about what this is to you, the viewer, watching this video. So there was a time in the past, not too long ago, when I made a video about ES5, ES6. I kind of talked about what those things were. I messed up a lot of it. If you read the comments, you can see what I messed up. But there was an aspect of it where I discussed this idea of var being the way to declare a variable in the previous version of JavaScript called ES5. And now there is another way to declare a variable, let, which is part of ES6. And then there is even another way to declare a variable known as const, which is also part of ES6. And these work in a slightly different way, and they clean up some problems, and they protect you against yourself and your own inevitable ability to make all sorts of strange errors. And so that's a separate discussion. Now, there is another change that can be looked at somewhat in the same way, which is that I used to be able to say, and I still can, and I still will, and I probably always will. I love function, don't go away from me. I can declare a function like this with some amount of arguments. There is a new way to do this exact same thing. Oh my goodness, look, I forgot to put a name. I forgot to name this function. And the reason why I forgot is because the thing that I'm talking about here with arrow functions, that's what's going to go over here. This is ES5. It's typically used, I think actually it's the only way you could use it. Someone's going to tell me and then I'll correct myself later. For anonymous functions. Anonymous functions, unnamed functions, inline functions. You'll see, if that's not familiar to you, I will explain that as well in the context of this video. But what you can see here is I'm saying function with these arguments execute this code. This function doesn't have a name. It's not called unicorn fluffy times or whatever. It's just called function. So now instead I can say, hey, look at this. These parentheses here. I can say, hey, let's instead of saying function, let's say arrow, which is an equals and a greater than, arrow, curly bracket, close curly bracket. So this is somewhat ES5, ES6. So one of the reasons to write functions like this, for this arrow syntax, is simply conciseness. Less typing, don't need function. We just say equals greater than. The interesting thing is one of the reasons for doing this is this idea of conciseness. This can become even more concise. In fact, these parentheses we're going to see as I show you some examples are optional. And in fact, not in some cases, this bracket is also optional. Oh, and I'm totally writing somewhere you can't see, but what I just wrote was optional. And in fact, let's say my function was going to return something. This return statement can in fact be optional or implicit. It can be just sort of assume that it's there, that you're going to return something. And eventually you can see, I'm going to give myself some more room here and not draw too high up there like I usually do, that I might have just done and had to restate what I'm saying. We can eventually write things that look like this. X arrow x times 2. What does this mean? This means actually create a function that takes an argument x and returns x times 2. So one reason is a new syntax. conciseness, common operations, and actually one of the things that I will show you is this kind of writing can be really useful when I eventually make a video about some other array functions that I'm going to use for some other tutorials that I'm doing. And if we look at the functions like map and reduce and filter, these are array functions that you can perform operations. Like if I wanted to just double the element of every, if I wanted to double the value of every element in an array, I could say map and give it this, and it's going to just happen in a nice and concise way. Now, there is another aspect of this that's key and somewhat crucial, which is that there is a word, a key word in JavaScript called this. And we've seen, you guys are familiar with it. This is the word that I always forget, especially when I'm doing object-oriented programming. I just say this.x and this.y. I'm always forgetting the this dot. This can refer to different things. In fact, if I'm just in a JavaScript sketch that I've written a piece of code that's running in the browser, if I just say this, it refers to the window object, the sort of global object. This always refers to something. It's the current context of where you are. Am I in this object? Am I in the global scope? And with this particular function syntax, you might want to use it in a particular context where you want to keep a certain value of this and not lose track of it. And in fact, this old way of defining a function can forget about what this should be referring to. And this way of doing it is a way where JavaScript will not forget. And so in previous versions of JavaScript, you might have seen things like bind and apply. You can use other functions to kind of bind and keep track of the this. And with the arrow function, the this will keep track of itself in a more elegant and hopefully way that you would have intended. So I realize that like out of context, that probably makes absolutely no sense. But I'm going to make a scenario in this video where I want this to equal something, and writing it this way, it fails, and writing it this way, it works. I will say, I erased my var becomes let. Var becomes let is pretty friendly. They're both three-letter words. Var means variable. Let is kind of like let this equal something. This transition to me is not as smooth. Function means I'm defining a function. Arrow, I guess we could make this sort of case that like these values, these arguments become transformed or get sent into here and do something. X becomes X times 2. So there is some kind of meaning there. But one reason why I tend to avoid using arrow functions all the time is that it can make, while it can make your code fewer characters, which sometimes is valuable for making it readable, it can be really hard for beginners when we're just starting out to be able to read and understand what the code is doing. So this video is to explore, you can't escape it. I might like to run away and never look at an arrow function, but I can't escape it. So this video is an attempt to unpack this even more. All right, let's actually look at some code. All right, if you're still watching this video, you're a very nice person, and I really appreciate it. I have a P5 sketch. It's doing nothing. It's just a blank canvas. I want to add something to it. I am going to say let button equal create button press. And then I'm going to say button dot mouse pressed. Now, whoops. In an older life, long ago, in another time, when I had less gray hair and was even a little bit more organized making these video tutorials, to be perfectly honest, I would have done something like this. Change background. And then I would have written a function down here, function, change background. And I would have said, this function is a callback to the mouse pressed event on the button. So button.mousePressed, that change background function, run whatever code is in here whenever you press the mouse on the button, and let's actually do that. I'm going to say background, random 255. So now, if I go back to the browser and I look at this code, every time I press the button, I get a new random grayscale background. This is my way of writing this code when I want to work in a sort of the most easy to understand way in a beginner context. I have a function here. I can see what it's named. I can see where it goes. So one thing I could do in JavaScript, which is there's no reason why I have to name the function and then put it down here. I could just take this whole function and put it in between the parentheses in mouse pressed. So I'm going to do that. You just put it right there, and I'm going to just hit save. It's going to like auto format it. And now that it's in there, it doesn't need a name. It sort of exists just for the event right here, I'm going to put a function in there, pass the function in as the argument itself. You know, which do I like better, one or the other? Who really knows? I don't know. But this is an anonymous function. It has no name. You could call it an inline function, although it happens over multiple lines. So that's step number one. Now, if I hit refresh, same exact thing is happening. I could now be even more concise. And I can get rid of the word function. And I can say equal arrow, and there we go. Hooray, I've used an arrow function. Hit refresh, and it's the same thing. And I don't know, do I need these? Could I even get away with something weird like this? Maybe. Oh, that looks so strange. Could that possibly be right? Somehow, I find this hard to believe that that could possibly be right. No, what did I do wrong here? Maybe this. See, this? Yes, maybe here. Yeah, let's try this. No. Okay, I think I figured it out. Let's try this one more time. What's optional? Okay, I could get rid of the curly brackets. Those are optional. If I get rid of those curly brackets, I also don't need this semicolon because it's one line. And then I should be able to do this. And now, in theory, this is also correct. It's very spooky, though. And this works too. Here's it. Have I helped anybody? Have I made the world a better place? Yes, I managed to write that in one line. But and I sort of guess I understand what's going on. But in the end, I'm very happy with it. There we go. I'm very happy with it like this. This is perfectly fine. I feel like I can breathe, I can relax, I can name everything in my code, and I can know what it's doing. But there are some cases where the arrow function really does help, and I will get to those eventually in these incredibly long-winded video tutorials that I'm making. Let's look at one such case. So let's say that I'm going to create a class, and I'm going to call this class counter. So this is somewhat of a trivial example that doesn't have a lot of practical value, although I think that I could expand it to start using like DOM element animations or API calls. So let's begin with something though that's very, very simple. The idea of this class, whenever I make a class, I need a constructor. I'm going to make a property called count, and I'm going to set it equal to 0. Then I'm going to write a function called countit, and I'm going to say this.count++. And I will just say, oh yeah, and let's do this. Let's also say this.p equals create p. So I'm going to make a paragraph element. And then I'm going to say this.p.html, this.count. What is going on? My goodness. So the idea here is that, and I'm going to get rid of all this stuff that I had from earlier in the video. I'm going to say no canvas. And I'm going to say let counter1 equal new counter. And then I'm going to say, I guess I guess I'll use the draw. You'll see, I have this plan. But for now, I'm just going to say function draw, which is a little bit weird, counter1.countit. Am I ready? So here we go. What's going to happen when I run this sketch? It's going to break because this needs to be a global variable. And by the way, this might be a time where I used const. I am never going to redeclare this object. I don't know. I'm just trying to get comfortable using const. When do I use const? If it's something that I want to not allow myself to reinitialize, redeclare in a different way, and protecting myself from mistakes. And, oh, you've got to do it up there. Oh boy. Wow, you can't, of course I can't do that. I can't make the const nothing and then read. That was a big failure for using const. That was my new sound effect. Okay, never mind. Okay, so let me just use let. Take it easy on me, please. I'm just going to use let. Now let's run this. And there it is. Ooh, look at that. I've got my counter going like this. Now here's the thing. I didn't really want to use that draw loop. I want each counter to count itself. So what I want to do is when I make a counter, I want to give it some things. Like I want to give it a starting value, and I want to give it a wait, a time. So I'm going to say what I want is this counter to start at 100, and I want it to count every 500 milliseconds. So this dot count should start as start, and I'm going to have a new variable called this dot wait, which will equal 500. And now what am I going to do? I am going to use, and I actually probably don't need to keep this dot wait. We'll see in a second. I could use this. I'll call this wait. You'll see in a second. I'm going to use this function called set interval. And what set interval does is it says, here's a callback, count it, right? That function down here, and then do that every so often. All right, ready? So this is the idea. I'm going to create a counter that is going to, and then I'm going to say like every 500 milliseconds, count up from 100 and update that paragraph element. Let's see what happens. Ah, counted is not defined. Oh yeah, counted is not defined. It's like not in the scope here. Oh, okay, well I know. I'm going to make this called a function counted. So it's not really like a function that's part of the class anymore. It's just like a function, right? So I'm going to name it function, and I'll put it even here. Like this is how I did it with that mouse pressed, right? Count that function, increase the count. Here we go. Cannot read what? Oh, it cannot do anything. Why? So hold on a second. Let's just see something. When I first run a sketch, if I were to just do something like and say console.log this, what I get is this thing called the window object. This refers to the global context, the window object. Now, if I'm in here, if I'm in the constructor, for example, and I say console.log this, oh, I'm referring to the counter object, because this JavaScript knows to repoint the keyword this to the current context, which is the current counter object. But why? What is happening in here? Console.log this. This is inside the class. It's a function inside the object. Can't I know that I'm talking about that object? And so now I'm going to refresh. And see, what is it console logging? The window object again. Spooky window up. No, it's not really spooky. So what do I do about this? Guess what? This is where the arrow function comes in. If I use an anonymous function right in here, so I can take this whole thing and I can put it in here, I can get rid of the name, right? So this is just me recreating this with an anonymous function. I'm going to hit refresh. It's still referring to the window object because I've named this function. But if I change this to the arrow syntax, let's see what happens now. There we go. And now I have my counter that's working. And here's the thing. What's magical, not really magical about this, is that what I've done is because I made this object oriented, and actually, to be honest, this doesn't need to be, this could be const again. Let's make them const. They're so constant. I can't even begin to, I can make a bunch of these starting at different values, going in with different speeds. And we'll see here that, there we go. I've got a bunch of different counters, each counting at their own rate, each starting at a different value. And this callback function remembers, and I want to take this out just to see. This callback function remembers the correct context, and I can have callbacks now inside of my class. A great point has been made in the chat, and actually when I was designing this scenario in my head to do this in this video, this is actually not the way I wrote it in my head. I meant to not get rid of the countit function. So let me just put that back for a second. So I'm going to rewrite this a little bit, which I think will be a little bit more clear. And I'm going to keep this in the countit function. I actually am going to make a variable called this.wait and have it equal to wait. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a new function, and I'm going to call it start. And there I'm going to say this.count. So this is kind of what I meant countit. I just rewrote this, but in I think a slightly more clear way, because now I'm creating a counter object. It has a starting counter, has an amount of time to wait, and a DOM element associated with it. It has a function which will always increase the count and put the count in the DOM element. And then it has the start function is what, and this should say, by the way, I'm forgetting the this dot wait. But here, this would break once again. Let's just put this back to function. Right? This totally makes sense. Set interval, this function, count it with this amount of weight. And I'm going to say counter1.start and counter2.start. And by the way, I could make an array of these, all with random starts. Counter3.start. Now let me run this. Uncaught. Counted is not a function because it's forgotten. Function is because it gets kind of globalized. It forgot about the current actual context of this. And it's just referring to window. Replace it with the arrow syntax. And now, ta-da! There we have our counter objects all counting separately. So just to double back for a second on being completely, totally, though that's sort of like one line way of writing this, I could actually get rid of these brackets and this semicolon, right? Because I can just now do this. So in theory, if you like to write code like this, this should also work. Let's refresh. Yeah. So this is now a way to write this in one line. I've completely confused myself. Looking at this, I kind of have no idea what's happening. Let me see if I can understand it. I want to set an interval. And what I want is for this.countit to happen every this.wait amount of time. OK, kind of makes sense. It's a little bit cryptic and weird because there's no arguments inside these parentheses, but we'll see what happens when we put arguments inside those parentheses in another video. Thanks for watching. I hope this context somewhat helps, and I'll probably come back and remake this video someday. Because here's the thing, this is the first time I've ever taught about arrow functions, and I only really learned about them a couple weeks ago, so just be kind. Okay, and not to, but to everybody, please, in the world, be kind. All right, talk to you soon. Goodbye.